Hi everyone. In today's tutorial, I'm going to take you through this surrealist sort of looking landscape. You're going to need a few different colors. These are the colors I've been using lately. I probably won't use every single one of these colors in the painting, but as we go through it, I'll tell you which ones I have used, and that way you can follow along. In these sorts of paintings, if you want to change it up or there's some colors that you don't have, you can always use something else. These are the brushes that I use mainly. We've got stipple brushes, flat brushes, round brushes, and the two brushes on the left are very important for blending, and we call those dry brushes. Their bristles are a little bit softer than the other brushes, and they're great for blending colors together. I also use two water pots, especially when you're using darker colors. The water gets dirty quite quickly, and if you keep one that's clean when you're using lighter colors like white, you can clean your brushes in those, and then you don't have to replace the water so much. These are the first four colors I'm using, so white, a cool yellow, a neon orange, and a violet color. So your first step is to grab a large stipple brush or a large round brush and create this circle with your brush. Then the next step is to grab some of that neon orange and color in the center of that white circle that we have left. This is to create a streaky sky. Try to make sure that you're cleaning your brush between when you're dipping it into the orange and into the purple, because otherwise it blends too much and we don't want it to turn brown. Next I have cobalt blue. You could probably use phthalo blue as well. And I've colored in the sides. Now all I'm doing is adding a few more strokes of, especially with neons are usually a little bit more transparent, or the paint itself is a little bit thinner. So you do need to be heavy-handed with neons sometimes. And then right in the center, I've added in some of that yellow, that cool yellow. All you need to do is load up your brush and put some big stripes in there. I'm doing that same thing with white that I've just done with yellow. Just be careful not to blend it too much. What we're really doing here is placing all of the colors that we want in the sky, and then we're going to blend it all together. I also added in some neon pink, and now I'm using that dry brush that I talked about, and I'm using sweeping motions that go up and down diagonally, sometimes in crisscrosses in different sections. And if you feel like you want a little bit more of a distinction between the colors, you can always add in some colors and use your dry brush again, which is what I've done. I've added in a few streaks of white and then gone over it with the dry brush. I'm doing that again. See how I'm just dabbing on some white and then using my dry brush to blend it in, and it creates that streaky look that we want. And you can see that the phthalo blue, or in my case the cobalt blue, has stayed on the outside, and then we have these little streaks of orange and pink. We can see a little bit of the violet, and then we've got those streaks of white, which sort of represent some clouds. Try not to blend too much, because otherwise it'll end up being one brown color, or you won't get that nice distinction. If that does happen, never fear. All you need to do is let it dry, or you can use a hairdryer and dry it, and you can go over it again, and that can still be your background or your base. I'm just using my finger and a little bit of white and yellow paint to create a moon. As you can see, I've created some clouds over the moon. I've put a little bit of pink and white together and created those clouds. I'm not entirely happy with it, so I do go back to it later. I'm letting it dry for the moment, and I've started on the road that is in the middle of the painting. You can draw in the lines if you want, so you have a guide. You don't necessarily have to do that if you don't want to. If you want to just freehand it, it's okay. And what I've done is I've dipped my brush in white and a little bit of that neon pink, and I've started to create texture with a large flat brush. You can see that at the back I've just dabbed and tapped to create that texture of the ground, and then I've dipped my brush into a little bit of that violet and also some white, and then starting to bring it forward a little bit. If you look at the strokes I'm doing right now, those strokes are thicker and they are longer, and that's because the road is closer to us. As things get further away from us, they seem smaller or lighter or further away, and that's also partly my color choices as well. So you can see that I've got that really light, it's almost like a lilac color now at the back, and also the pink. And then as we get closer, our colors are a little bit brighter and darker. Once I've put all of these bold strokes on, it's a very similar technique to what we just did with the sky. So once I'm happy with all of those colors and I've blended them all in together, then I will use a different dry brush, because once you've used a dry brush and it's got paint all over it and you clean it, then it becomes wet. So it's always good to have a couple of soft bristled white brushes that you can use for blending. And all I'm doing here is layering it so that the colors blend into one another rather than just having strips of color. We want that kind of faded effect to happen. So I'm incorporating some of the yellow into that lilac purpley color at the back. And you can see here that I've just done a little bit of dry brushing to blend it in together. Now on either sides of that pathway, I wanted that road in the middle to look a little bit more distinct. So I'm using brown. Now what I've done here is I've used burnt umber, which is a dark brown color, and I've cut it with a lot of water. So I've mixed it in. I haven't done that on the canvas. I've done that on my color palette, and I've dipped my brush into water and added some water. So it's almost like it has that watercolor effect, and that's the basis for our edges. At the front, you can see the color on the right in the bottom right corner. That's burnt umber. Now what I'm doing is using a little bit less. I'm still using some water, but I'm using less water to make that color darker and more bold. And then I'm trying to fade it into the background. So the darkest brown should be at the front, then we have a medium brown color, and then it should fade all the way into the back. And I'm doing that same technique of bold, long, thicker brush strokes, so applying a little bit more pressure to the front, because we should be able to see more texture at the front. And then as we get further away towards the horizon line, it should get a little bit smaller. I'm blending some of that brown into the pathway in the middle. And in turn, I'm also trying to blend a little bit of those pathway colors back into the ground so they all fade in together nicely. I'm using a flat brush here. Flat brushes are good for quite a few different things because you can use them to paint straight lines, but you can also turn them around and create thick lines as well, so they're quite versatile. So now I'm using my flat brush so that we get a thicker line at the front, and then I turn it sideways so we get that thinner line when I'm going towards the horizon line. This will take you a little bit of time. This is part of the fun part of painting, where you get to pick up some colors and pick up a brush and just really have some fun with those strokes. You can see now how the pathway in the middle and the dirt or the ground or the terrain on the other side, the brown terrain, is starting to blend in together, and it looks a little bit more cohesive. I've tried to make sure that towards the horizon line is the lightest, then gets a little bit darker as it gets close to us, and then darkest right at the front. This is one of those paintings where nothing needs to be particularly perfect, and it's just playing with colors and composition. When I started this painting, the only things that I drew in were the horizon line, and then the lines for the road in the middle that you see there. That's all I drew in. If you would like to draw that in, if you have a ruler and you would like to draw that in as well to give you a guide, you can. You don't necessarily have to if you want to do freehand. But other than that, before I started, I wasn't really sure what this painting was going to look like. I wasn't sure if I wanted flowers, or I wanted a sky, or I wanted a blue sky or a grey sky. So if you wanted to play with colors as well, you could change up your colors. Your sky, you could use some black and some violet and some red and some white to make it a little bit more dramatic. Now what I'm doing here is layering on some of the neon orange. trying to incorporate a little bit of that into the white. And you can see with the brush strokes and creating that different texture, it starts to represent those different textures that we see in dirt or on terrain, on rough terrain. I've added in a few highlights. I wanted it because it's always nice to have a little bit of contrast. So I've gone through with a little bit of white and just added in a few highlights. And in the darker sections, I've added in some neon pink and some neon orange. Those neons always look, or fluorescent, fluoro, neon or fluoro, whichever one you would like to call it. I always find that those look really nice on dark backgrounds. Usually rule of thumb is if you want them to look really vibrant, if you've got a black background or a dark background, paint some white over it first, and that will make those colors really vibrant. But I wanted this to sort of all blend together. Now I'm fixing up the moon, just going over it with my fingertip, and white with a tiny bit of that cool yellow. And then just using my finger to smudge it a little bit, create that illusion of that there's some clouds over it. I've added in a few highlights. So now that it's dry, now that the sky is dry, I wanted to add in a few more highlights, the neon orange to complement what could potentially be reflected on the ground. I've put some orange over those clouds just to make it look like there might be mist or clouds over it. Now what I'm doing is drawing in my trees, or rather I'm marking where I would like my tree trunks to go. Again, I am using that burnt umber mixed with water and just lightly using a thin round brush with a pointed tip and marking where I would like each tree to go. I wanted the trees to frame that road in the center, or that pathway in the center. You can see right at the back where the horizon line is, the trunks are a lot smaller and shorter, and then as they get closer they get longer and taller. Now I'm using some of that burnt umber, not cut with as much water, not mixed with as much water. We want the tree trunks to look a little bit more prominent. Now I'm starting to thicken them up. I'm using a flat brush here. I'm using it on the side, the thin angle side, and going straight up. And you can see as I'm getting closer to the front, my tree trunks are getting longer, they're getting taller, and they're getting a little bit thicker. It gives us that illusion that things are closer to us or further away. I wanted the trees to be straight. I wanted this to be uniform and have some symmetry to it. Once you've marked in where you want your trees to be, then all you need to do is start creating your branches. Again, I'm using a flat brush here. You could potentially use a round brush depending on the thickness. But if you want to make a thicker line, you load up your brush and you apply more pressure. And then when you want a thinner line, you remove some of that pressure as you go up into the branches. You can see my pet bird on my shoulder there. He's hanging out with me. Now I'm creating the trees in the background. I'm using a little bit of neon orange, a little bit of that cool yellow, and then the tops of the trees I'm using white for highlights because that's where the light of the moon is hitting. Because this painting moves away from realism and is supposed to be a little bit playful and fun, I decided that I wanted my trees to look round. I mean, usually trees don't necessarily look like that, depending on the type of tree, of course. But I just wanted this to be uniform. I wanted to play with shapes, play with geometric shapes, play with straighter lines, and then also play with different colors as well. I'm using the same colors for the next trees, but making them a little bit bigger, a little bit darker, so that they look like they're a little bit more closer. They're a little bit closer to us than the trees in the background. Same technique, just using a round brush and dabbing and loading up my brush, dabbing, tapping, using my darkest color first. So in this case, the neon orange is the darkest color, and then using yellow to create some of those highlights at the top of the tree, the top and the sides, because the moon is in the center. So the light's going to be hitting the trees at the top, and then on that left tree that I'm doing now, the highlights will be more on the right side of the tree because it's closer to the moon. And that right tree, the highlights are going to be on the left side of the tree because that's the closest part to the moon. Adding in some more neon orange just to create that contrast, make it look a little bit darker underneath because underneath the trees don't get as much light. Now with these next trees, I am using a small flat brush, and I'm creating, instead of dabbing and tapping, I'm creating bold strokes. And I'm using that violet color and also red. And I'm just loading up my brush. I'm dipping it into the red and dipping it into the violet. So one side of the brush is red, the other side of the brush is violet. And then just making these little flicks. Not too big because it is still at a distance, so we want to make sure that the biggest and boldest strokes are for the trees at the front. So you can see when I've dipped my brush into the red and the violet, you can see those different streaks of color. Just be careful not to blend them too much, and also if you find that your brush is starting to blend the two colors together when you're picking it up, then just make sure you wash your brush, wash your brush and clean it between picking up paint and reloading your brush. Like I said, if you don't have access to these colors or you have slightly different colors, it's totally okay. This is definitely one of those paintings where you can play with color. I'm doing the same technique for this tree, these trees that are closer to us in the foreground. But to mix it up, I'm also using the violet and some cool yellow. Cleaning my brush in between when I'm loading it up, dipping half of it into the yellow, half of it into the violet. Mixing in some red there as well. You can see how many times I keep loading up my brush because you don't want to keep, see if those few flicks that I just did, see how it's turning a little bit of a brown color? That means it's time for me to wash my brush and make sure that I keep those colors distinct from one another and not blend them too much. So same technique on the other side. The only difference is I'm using the same size brush, same flat brush, but I'm applying more pressure and I'm making those strokes a little bit longer. It makes those leaves look a little bit bigger and a little bit closer to us. Starting with my darkest color on the bottom, which was the violet and the red, and then adding in some of the yellow and red. So if this is a painting that interests you, I hope you're following along. I hope you're painting with me. If you're not painting with me, that's okay. Thank you for watching. This is certainly a painting where you can just experiment with shapes and colors and strokes. You can have a lot of fun with it. Okay, last but not least, now we are painting the trees that are closest to us in the foreground. I have used it's called Brilliant Purple. It's kind of a light lilac color and an aqua blue color. Same technique. I'm using a slightly bigger flat brush here so I can make those leaves and those strokes bolder. See how I'm washing my brush between each time I'm loading up those colors, and I'm dipping it into the Brilliant Purple or the lilac color, and then half of my brush is in the blue and then half of my brush is in the purple color, creating those strokes. Now, if you wanted to, I didn't wait for this to dry because I was too impatient and I was really enjoying what I was doing and I didn't want to stop. But if you wanted to, you could let the other trees dry so that when you go over it, you don't blend in any of the other colors. It's not necessarily a bad thing because it looks like you can see some of the leaves or some of the tree behind the tree in the foreground. Almost like you can see through some of those leaves. You could take a break, make a cup of tea, call a friend, wait for it to dry and come back. Acrylics dry pretty quickly. If you wanted to, you could also use a hairdryer and dry it as well. Okay, to layer on top, and this is where it gets a bit tricky. I mean, we don't mind having a little bit of that bright green because yellow and blue make green. But you don't want to turn, if you want to keep some of those beautiful colors that you've got, you don't want to blend too much. So what I've done here is I've cleaned my brush completely and I've dipped my brush into that fluorescent or neon yellow, and the other half of my brush has been dipped into white, and I'm just doing those bold strokes over again. Exactly the same technique on the other side. You want to make sure that you're keeping those brush strokes distinct as well. You don't want to blend them in too much. That's why I keep reloading my brush with color, doing couple of strokes and then cleaning my brush and then reloading it and doing it again. So if you look at each one of those strokes, they start to look distinct and you can see the different colors in them. You can see a little bit of that, maybe almost a turquoisey sort of green color that is coming through because the neon yellow and blue are mixed together. They're mixing together. A little bit of that brilliant purple or that lilac color. You can still see the aqua blue coming through. Usually when I paint trees, I do the branches first and then I paint over it with the leaves. This time around, I just wanted to show you a bit of a different technique. So I drew in the trunks and a couple of branches, but now is when I'm actually doing some of the branches in the tree, so you can see some of those. This is when those finer details come into the painting. I'm thickening up the trunk to make it the size that I want, and I'm using black for this. I'm using black because I wanted there to be a bit more of a contrast between the brown on the ground. And I think black and red go really nicely together, especially for a dramatic painting like this. I'm starting to create those highlights. So I've based it with black, which is the darkest color. And then on top of that, I am using a cool red. Loading up my brush with quite a bit of paint, and I'm adding in the branches. Now I'm using a light pink color. You can see it on my palette, just near the bottom corner. There it is. I'm dipping my brush in now. And again, what we need to think about is the lightest highlights will be where the moon's light is hitting the trees. So whichever part of the tree is closest to the moon will have the most light. So I've used that light pink to sort of complement the red and used it where I think that the most light will hit from the moon. Now all I've done is use that same light pink, created some bushes with my stipple brush and doing some highlights at the top with some white. Again, the tips of those bushes are where the moon's light will be hitting. To create a little feature in the center, I wanted to draw in a little lonely figure. All I'm using here is a round brush, thin pointed round brush. And painting in that figure, I drew the body first, a little bit thicker, and then the shoulders, then the legs, feet, head, then some highlights on the left side. It doesn't really matter where your highlights go, but it is nice to highlight. And I've done another little figure in the background, whether they're following each other, whether one is following the other one or they're looking at each other or approaching each other, we're not quite sure. In the foreground, I felt it needed something else. It just needed one little other feature to finish it off. And I wanted to do something interesting with branches and trees. Again, I'm using black, which complements the trees that we see at the front, because I use black for their trunks. I'm using a thin round brush here with a point at the end. These trees at the front, I think I'm maybe channeling my inner Tim Burton. It looks like maybe something out of Edward Scissorhands or The Nightmare Before Christmas or something like that. Just for something different, I wanted to paint the branches with those sharp edges that are curling around. Like I said before, in this painting I wanted to try looking at geometric shapes and playing with geometric shapes, which is why some of the trees are round. So I'm marking in where I want all my branches, and I tried to make my branches and twists and turns go different ways. Then I've gone over them again in black to make them a little bit more distinct, which you've seen here. Then once I was happy with the amount of branches that I had and all the different twists and turns they had, to complement the white light that is coming from the moon, we're just doing some highlights. And again, if you're ever unsure of where to put the highlights and the shadows, just think to yourself, where is the light source coming from and what is going to be closest? What's closest to the light? And there you have it, completed, finished. If you didn't paint along with me today, that's okay. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. See you later.